Welcome to Tech Leader TV. I'm your host, John Thomas Flynn, and this is our 10th season of TLTV. And today we inaugurate our new IT Industry C-Level series, interviews with private sector industry leaders from the C-suite. What does that mean? Chief Executive Officers, CEOs, CIOs, CTOs, etc. Traditionally, as you know, Tech Leader TV has interviewed primarily government sector IT and program leadership. And we shall continue to do so. In fact, we're happy to announce that our guest later this month, in August, will be none other than the State Chief Information Officer, Amy Tong. But today our show is sponsored by Veeam Software. Our guest is Veeam's Vice President, Danny Allan, and our topic is a timely one, ransomware. And thanks for watching. Tech Leader TV website continues to set new audience records. We're reaching thousands of state IT decision makers and vendor partners who recorded 250,000 page views last month alone. We recorded 2 million page views last year, and our goal is to double that again this year in 2017. Before we get started and I introduce Danny, just a few observations, if I may. When I became the first Chief Information Officer of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the mid-1990s, security was a part-time issue handled by our facilities manager. My first introduction to security infractions, in fact, involved our own data center operators, as accessing tax records of famous Boston athletes like Larry Bird and Carl Yastrzemski. And even when I left my position as California's first CIO in 1999, we still did not have a Chief Information Security Officer. But soon after that, security had become, and for the last 5 years continues to be, the #1 issue for CIOs and CEOs across the country. And for good reason. Data breaches costing tens of millions of dollars, confidential information accessed not only on the general public, but on presidential candidates. 36 state voter systems were the targets of hackers last year. Enterprise data systems are frozen, incapacitated, and held for ransom by person or persons unknown. It's a brave new world, and an ugly one. The need for storage, backup, and disaster recovery strategies has never been greater. The state of California requires every department to have a technology recovery plan and a coordinator, some of whom are in our audience today, and hopefully watching this streaming video back in their offices. Each department is required to test their backup and recovery operations regularly, and even have their program executives, not the CIO, not the CISO, but have their program executives sign off on compliance. However, the state auditor has called actual security compliance into question, citing overwhelming shortcomings. But that was over a year ago. And now, with a new state CISO and significant legislature interest, changes have been in the works. The latest security reporting compliance scorecard has demonstrated prodigious progress. A good sign for sure. But there's always more to be done, never so true than in the field of enterprise security. Well, as usual on Tech Leader TV, we're going to continue to do our best to keep the spotlight on the state's management of its multi-billion-dollar annual IT investment, however much it is, to make government more secure, more effective, and more efficient. And hopefully we'll have a little fun and keep your interest at the same time. Our motto is simple, as I like to say, California can always do better. Let's begin the journey now with our discussion on technology, government, politics, and as I like to say, other unnatural acts. I'll be right back in a minute with our guests, and we'll get started. As I mentioned, our guest today is Danny Allan. Danny's the Vice President at Veeam Software, responsible for envisioning, designing, and delivering secure digital infrastructure solutions. He has over 20 years of experience in technology and security, including vulnerability assessments, forensics, vulnerability with the testing of military intelligence and other sensitive government agencies, hush-hush stuff that we always like to talk about on Tech Leader TV. He also worked at the Carleton University in Canada, where he was responsible for secure network design. And he also holds several software patents in the cloud and security field. So, Danny Allan, welcome to Tech Leader TV. It's an inaugural part of our C-level series, as I like to call it, where we're going to have executives from our sponsors and other interested industry leaders, as opposed to our usual guests who are with the government. It's always nice to have people from the dreaded private sector, as we used to say in Boston. Interesting how you got here. It was a little difficult for us in the studio when we started, but as I think I'll mention again so they can hear it, the biggest issue when I was first CIO in Massachusetts back in the 90s was, the facilities manager was the security chief, and the biggest worry we had was our employees accessing income tax returns of famous athletes. Carly Yastrzemski. I remember Larry Bird was the first one with the Boston Celtics, and the guy had a part-time job doing this kind of thing. And even in California, where I left as their first CIO in 1999, we still didn't have a CISO. So fast forward a few years later, and now it's not only does everybody seem to have one, but as I mentioned, in California you have to have one. Not only a state CISO, along with the CIO, but a CISO in each organization, and a backup and recovery coordinator, and a privacy person. Not to mention diversity, but we're not going to get into that today. It's become a real industry in and of itself, and for good reason, with the usual blemishes and warts and et cetera. But let's talk a little bit to you. How did you get involved in this area? Was it something you studied in school, or how did it happen? No,
not really. A lot of people in the security space, similar story is they played around with technology, and I've always done that, been interested in technology, and how do things work, and how do they work, and how do they break? And so when I was in college, I was playing around with the system, and I happened to find a vulnerability that now you would probably get in trouble for talking about these things or discussing these things in public. But I found a vulnerability. I went and said, hey, here's a problem. You should really fix this. Your students could come in and change the marks or pay off their tuition and those kinds of things.
Never happened.
Well, back then they hire you. Now, of course, they might kick you out of the university or charge you for that type of activity. But back then it was fun for me. I'm always curious, how do things work, and the contrast to that, how do they break?
And you started out of school, basically, in this field?
I did. I started working for the university that I went for. This was back in the days of mainframes and Banyan Vines network, before the systems that we have in place today. But
Massachusetts vendor, as a matter of fact.
Yes, yeah, they were.
I used to know the CEO because he got the job. Well, I digress. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's amazing. We've obviously gone a significant distance from then, which was, as you say, a part-time job for someone doing security, to now it's a full-fledged effort of most organizations to try to address it.
Yeah, and I know we'll get into this as we talk about it, but what's so the irony is that it's become such a critically important issue, but the rub is where's the money to support it? Like everybody says, even if they can find out how much money they're actually spending, which is always a challenge, but if you want more money, you have to displace the ongoing IT projects, and not to mention the M&O of the infrastructure and legacy systems, and people are reluctant to, and the budget crunchers are reluctant to put that money forward until you have a digital Pearl Harbor or something like that, which is always right around the corner when you think about it. So it is a challenge for them. So as we said, it's becoming regular news, and our subject today, I think, is a very timely one: ransomware. And it wasn't even called that, but we spoke about a little of this before the show. But as you know, I guess it was probably 10 years ago now, when Gavin Newsom, the expected to be next governor of California, seen in many quarters, but he was mayor of San Francisco at the time, and there was basically a ransomware. But nobody called it that then. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that, because you know the details.
Well, yeah, that's exactly the case. So there was a network administrator there. His name was Terry Childs. And he almost single-handedly ran the whole network for the city of San Francisco and controlled all the logins and passwords for all of the routers and switches and networking gear that existed. And there became a disagreement, apparently, between himself and the management team, and he locked them out. And so for 12 days, the city of San Francisco was locked out of their networking. And he refused to divulge the passwords, and it was interesting. He said they're not qualified. actually have the credentials to access that. And eventually it was negotiated, and they did pass over the credentials and things went back to normal, but that was ransomware. They needed access to the systems and they couldn't get it until they negotiated with him.
Well, you leave out the juiciest part, and that was he wasn't gonna come clean until Gavin Newsom met with him.
Yes.
So that was the what would you call it, the not the bribe, but or the ransom. That was the actual ransom.
Yes.
Was an audience with the Mr. Newsom. It's you know, you go from the rational to the absurd in some cases, and look where it is now. 10 years, was that about 10 years ago?
It was 2008, I believe.
Okay,
it was.
good call, good call. And it's also headline news. Some of the disasters but it's not just funny. I mean, that may have disrupted a number of issues, and it probably had an impact on the collections of fees and things like that. But when it happens now, particularly with a mega state like California, which takes in, you know, $250 billion in various revenues every year. Think about that. That's $1 billion a day or a working day. It can have a huge impact. And some of the ones we read about just recently, there was one with the TV station, right, in San Francisco, the KVIE, was it, or one of those?
KQED, I think
That's
it
right.
was. Yeah, they were hit by a ransomware attack. And what's interesting is here's an organization that knew about ransomware for sure. They reported on it. They would be on the news almost every day. And so they would have all the systems in place, the firewalls, the malware scanning, the email scanning systems. And so an organization that's very tuned into this type of thing, I'm sure no doubt educated their employees on what they should open and not open, and they get hit by ransomware. So it just shows how prolific these types of things are, and also how difficult they are to defend against.
And the one that I'm thinking of that was very interesting because it involved the Bitcoin again. Why don't you explain that a little bit and how that they finally started to see some withdrawals, I think, about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, so that was the WannaCry attack. Two big recent attacks recently. One was WannaCry, one was Petya. So in the WannaCry attack, lots of rumors of where it came from, but regardless, this ransomware attack comes out, and the payment is Bitcoin. This is one of the enablers of ransomware, is that it used to be very difficult historically to take money out of the system, and if they did take money out of the system, you could trace the money trail. Well, now with cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Ethereum, there's a number of these now, it anonymizes all of that. And so you can go through what they call a cryptocurrency tumbler to extract money out, and you have no idea where the money came from and where it went to, and so it becomes very difficult to track. And so last week, I think it was on Thursday, actually the WannaCry attackers cashed out, if you want to use that term, in about 3 subsequent transactions, that money, and people are still scrambling to understand, well, who was it behind that, attack?
Yeah. And it's such a prolific issue. We also talked about the fact that the state of California, one of the departments in the state of California, just to test their security, sent out a phishing email to all the employees within that department, several hundred if I'm not mistaken, with and click here if you want to hear about your, what was it, the back pay or something like that?
Yeah, retroactive
pay.
Yes.
Well, sure. I mean, that was a damn good bait set out there, huh? And what happened?
Well, I didn't see the results of that, but I'm sure that many people clicked on it. So people are always, I always talk about people, process, technology. People are often the weakest link, and that's because even if they know what they should do, and actually if you look at the state administrative manual, if you look at section 5320, it says, hey, we need to educate and train users on this. Even if you
That's
do
the state of California.
This is the state of California. It's based off of, there's a federal standard called NIST 800, that's 53, National Institute for Standards and Technology. Same thing, educate your employees on at least an annual basis, and certainly when they come on board. But even if they know what to do, if I have a director working for me, and they get an email out of the blue one day and say, hey, we're going to promote you to senior director, we're going to give you a 30% pay raise. What do? They get excited, and then they get the job offer in the mail, and what's the very first thing that they do? They open it, right? Because they've been in contact. So even if people know what to do, the propensity for greed and just human behavior dictates that these things continue to exist.
Yeah, I mean, some of them are obvious. You know, I always wondered about those. I always wondered why, when I sent money after that, I got that email from that person in Uganda about why that I never heard from him again, right? But some of them are so enticing along the lines you just described that you can understand why it happens. And of course, with that example that happened in California, it's not the people that clicked that got in trouble. It was the person that instigated it.
Who sent it out?
You know? I don't know if he lost his job. That's rare, but still. Let's talk about risk for a second. You know, with these agencies, you know, we talk about vulnerabilities, attacks, incidents, and breaches, and maybe that's where you should start. Talk about those and the difference between them and how they play out in this whole environment.
Sure, yeah. There's always four things that I've focused on in understanding within the security profession. One is vulnerabilities. It's interesting for two reasons. One is it tells you the mindset of the people who are doing research. So vulnerabilities are published. Last year there was slightly over 10,000. It's the first time there was 10,000 published vulnerabilities. But it tells you what the security researchers are thinking about. It also...
Just to interrupt though, vulnerability being a software application vulnerability,
yes,
basically?
A bug in the software
system, yeah.
that can cause
Right.
a problem down the road.
Okay.
And what you find is they continue to grow, and it tells you the mindset of the white hat researchers, the people who are on the good side, you might say, and also the interesting types of techniques that they're using. So very valuable to understand that. The second is attacks. I actually find attacks to be the most interesting personally for me because it tells you the mindset of the attacker. I worked in managed security services for a bit. We saw about 1 billion attacks per day. That includes spam and network scanning and all of that. AT&T, I've heard they're up to 20 to 30 billion incidents per day. So very big numbers, but it tells you what does the attacker actually believe is going to be successful. Hugely fascinating to dive into that. Third category is about incidents. So now this is where things are actually successful. Microsoft puts out a report every year called the Incident Report, Microsoft Security Incident Report, that tells you the success rates of this malware. And I find that interesting because it tells you how effective the programs that the state of California and the departments and the agencies are putting in place. And right now you see incidents are about 1% of actual attacks result in some kind of incident. And then the last area that I think is probably the most interesting from a state and department level is actual breaches, because a breach is when an event actually occurs and data is exfiltrated. I've heard anecdotally, and I don't have hard numbers on this, that 49 million records of California state citizens was compromised last year. So whatever that number is, understanding where that data came from, where it went, what happened to it in that money chain, very, very fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It is, and I'm sure your number is accurate, if not conservative, to tell you the truth, because in the state of California, if there's a breach of, I think it's just personal information. I could be wrong. I think it's personal information of over 50 or something like that. They have to notify the Attorney General's office. So it is, and if you go in there, you can see it. It doesn't tell you much. It tells you who's reporting a breach and when it happened. I did a Freedom of Information request on it, but they wouldn't give. I said, I just want to know how many breaches were there, how many records of Californians were impacted, but they wouldn't give it to me. But anyway, it is. What can you do? I mean, you talk about, and I mentioned it during our monologue. You have all kinds of rules and regulations and compliance routines, which, as we said, the state auditor reported that over 90% of departments weren't compliant. Now there's a new scorecard that came out. There's a new sheriff in town, Peter Liebert's been on this show, good guy. He has turned this around, at least on the scorecard, and the improvement is 180 degrees. And it's up over 90% compliant, at least in terms of the reports. I don't know if it's apples and oranges yet, haven't just found out about this. But there is a big issue between, I think as you described at one time, between actual compliance and regulations of compliance. And why don't you talk about that a little bit? I think it's important.
Yeah, so you'll find in organizations like that, they have two arms. They have an assessment arm where they actually go out and do a technical assessment of how secure is the organization. And they will use automation and tools and products to say, is there vulnerabilities that exist? Is there holes that we need to be concerned about? And so that's one aspect of it. And actually, I come out of that space. We had a 96% penetration rate of systems that we would test. So the reality is...
Meaning what?
96% of the systems that we would go out and test, we would find a vulnerability in and be able to compromise that system. Which tells you that given enough time, almost anything can be compromised. But if you said, I really need something secure, there's this saying in the IT industry saying, well, in case the computer in concrete, bury it 20 feet in the ground and it's secure. The reality is it doesn't need to be at that level. Everything is compromised given enough resources and time. But the second aspect of that, so that's the assessment, the second aspect is governance, regulation, and compliance, or GRC it's sometimes called. Those are very different things. And what I'm a big proponent of is making sure that your GRC, making sure that your compliance actually has real impact over on the security side. Because even if you're not going to get perfect security, implementing the regulations and the policies, and I know that the state of California has done this. They have a document called the State Administrative Manual that covers in, I think it's 5325.
SAM, you're all familiar with that?
Yeah, the SAM document that says you should do these activities. And when they're explicit in the types of activities that you should do, so for example, they talk about recovery and making sure that that's tested on a regular basis. If you're explicit, that improves the security, which is always a good thing. We can always do better. We might not be perfect, but as you said, we can always do better.
Sure, sure. And yeah, it's kind of scary, and you think about it again when you have such an issue, and it's such a high-profile matter, and it is talk about career is over. I mean, career is seriously over as a security officer, and again we have that rub of not having the money a lot of times to fund the kind of security that these people want. And I know when you have, for example, as we have today in our audience, some folks that are actual data, the technology recovery coordinators for their departments, they have a huge responsibility. And I'm talking to private to a lot of them, they're just shaking their head and saying, geez, I want to do this, I need to do this, and I know I'm way down here, and they want to fund a $1 billion accounting system. So, it's very difficult to get the kind of attention it needs, not only in California. All CIOs at NASCIO, the State CIO Association, the federal folks we talk with, they all have that how do you balance it out? I mean, you can't throw enough money at it, right? So you need these regulations and compliance rules and an executive champion,
yes.
Which is interesting because in the state of California you have the chief information officer, and you have in all cases the CISOs reporting to the CIO. It wasn't always that way. It started off over. I didn't want to go into that, but basically over the last 10 years it has been that the CISO reports, and that is kind of a controversial issue. If you talk to most CISOs, they don't think they should report to the CIO. And you could see that particularly, as I was saying, when you run into a CISO, information security officer, and they want to get something done, but their CIO is blocking it in some way, or just doesn't think it's a priority. Has many other priorities, obviously. But that goes to the whole reason. Well, should that CISO actually be reporting to the state CISO or the corporate CIO or the state CIO, or should they be reporting to the CEO? Should they have a seat at the table?
My preference is the CEO, and the reason for this is that CIOs typically are very focused on the budget. So generating a profit's probably the wrong term, but creating value for the agency or the department that they work for, and so they're very much focused on the TCO and ROI. Which doesn't necessarily always balance well with reducing risk for the organization. And so having those two complementary in some ways is better than having a hierarchy, because reducing risk is obviously paramount at the top executive level.
Yeah. Well, and as I'm sure you're aware of, when this really came out, it didn't come out so much in government, but it came out in places like Target and credit card companies, et cetera, et cetera. And these were huge impacts. I mean, talking about $1 billion impact on the bottom line. And in some of the discussion about governance and where that CISO belongs, there was an article that talked about the board of directors. And if you were on a board of directors of a major corporation and you didn't know the first name of your CISO, you were risking being liable as a fiduciary responsibility, because that's how critical it was. Ain't seeing that in government.
Right.
Ain't seeing it. And that's a problem.
Well, if there's two benefits of this whole ransomware and security evolution that we're in, it's two things. It's taught us about cryptocurrencies. That's obviously a benefit. And the second is it's raised awareness to the executive level. It's never been at that level before. It's always been lower in the organization. So if people say, what's the upside to ransomware, that would be it.
Yeah, in fact, you're right. And sometimes it does take that digital Pearl Harbor to all of a sudden say, because I think it was the governor of South Carolina, Haley is now a UN ambassador. She had a huge issue on her hands over a security breach that really was one of the reasons she didn't run for re-election again. And there's been a few CIOs and CISOs around the country that actually have lost their jobs over these. So this is a real critical issue for them, and it's not been resolved. In fact, I used to believe when I was CIO, if I had a CISO, I wanted that person to report to me. But I've really changed over the last few years just from some of the things that you're talking about. Talk about how do we protect against this? You've talked about the four horsemen of the apocalypse here. vulnerabilities, attacks, incidents, and breaches, but what are we supposed to do?
So the traditional ways have always been user education. We talked about that. It's not that it's failed. It's still very valuable. It's part of the SAM, and we should continue to do that. Focus on people. We've focused on network protections, and we should continue to do that. Don't want to minimize that. And we focused on environmental protections like antivirus. But even after all of that, we still have these challenges. And so I go beyond those. I say we start from the expectation that things are going to be compromised, and go from there. And so if you start from the expectation that things will be compromised, that ransomware is going to occur, then you get in place things which you've been doing, like the technology recovery program that you plan to recover from these things. And so in the availability space, we talk about this 3-2-1 rule, which is always make sure, if it's data and applications you're trying to protect, make sure that you have 3 copies of the data on 2 different media types and 1 off-site. And the good news is that's actually explicitly spelled out in the SAM in 5325 and also in the NIST standards that you should have this off-site data protection. So if there's actually compliance with those regulations, it's a good thing.
Okay. Okay. You know, with the other issue now is with so much of the data going into the cloud, so to speak. I mean, the first thing when that was mentioned, everybody, you know, in the government clutched their pearls and said, oh my God, we're not going to be able to do this. But the reality is it's going that way. Yeah. And obviously it adds one more level of another challenge, if you will, in terms of that security. What's the latest on the cloud and security, and what's the thinking as we move forward into what's becoming really a fact of life for organizations, and it's going to hit government very, very significantly eventually? It
is. The state of California has a stated cloud-first policy, of course. And so this kind of multi-cloud world, it does 2 things. One is it increases the complexity. And with increased complexity comes lowered availability, lowered security. And so that's something to be aware of. Second thing that cloud does actually, people say, well, I'm really worried about the security of cloud. But most of the cloud providers, their brand is dependent on making sure that they have high availability, that security is in place. And so the example I give, when I get my paycheck every 2 weeks, I can put it under my mattress, or I can hug it and hold it, or I can put it in the bank, who is regulated by the FDIC, and their whole brand is about protecting my paycheck. Right. And so my expectation actually that cloud is good from that perspective. It actually helps to elevate the security stance that we're at. But it's still something that the agency, that the department, that the organization has to own, because ultimately it is their name on the line if something is to go south. Well, isn't that one of the, again, a rub in the sense you want them to own it? Are they going to? This goes into the custodial care and all that issue, but if it's an off-premises cloud, do they still own the data? Who owns the data? The organization still owns the data. They're responsible for it. The home organization. Yes. Okay. And one of the reasons for that, if you have the DMV or tax agency and they're putting all their customer data in there, if they put that in clear text without encryption and without appropriate protections in place, then it's really the agency that is responsible for that. And so making sure that you control, own, and protect the data still lies ultimately, I suppose, with the CEO of the organization or of the agency. I remember one of the challenges with that whole that whole environment was the fact that the state was, not just California, but states were saying, look, we're going to give you this, but we want to be able to audit. We want to be able to go out to your data center and blah, 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 and get access to it. And he said, hey, we have multi-customer data centers. We're not going to let you see that data. So it's like and that's an issue I don't think that's been totally resolved yet. It hasn't. It's an evolving space for sure, but ownership, I believe, still belongs with the agency and the protection of the data itself. Yeah. What the cloud gives you, it gives you tremendous resiliency, but it still doesn't give you the data protection that you need for business availability. And the reason I use that example, if you have a Terry Childs, he came in and purposely locked people out. If you have an administrator who comes in and purposely deletes data, the cloud isn't going to protect you from that. You actually need to have the practices in place to pull the data out of the cloud and put it in your repositories, as an example. Well, that goes into another area, the whole issue of, okay, you've had your disaster, whatever you want to call it, whether it's terrorist or just an inside job, whatever it is, but the whole issue of being able to have the backup and recovery capability in a disaster, even though it's being tested. And I've had CIOs and CISOs on here, and if we had the avian flu hit and the governor said tomorrow no employees could come downtown to work, could we work at home? Could we access our systems? Or if they were destroyed, could we jump on that
information from the data center down to Vallejo or something like that. And I wonder if it's always really, if it's adequate, if it's actually being tested in such a way that, yeah, you could pick up right where you left off and it would be transparent to the user. What do you think?
I think it's rare that people are actually doing the testing that they need to. And I'm a big believer that we're focusing now as an industry.
Even though the executives are signing off on it.
Even though they're signing off on it. So there's rudimentary tests. And actually, if you look at the TRP, it says in Section 10, it says that it does need to be tested at least on an annual basis. But if you look at the father of that document, at the NIST document, it actually says that you need to test it not only annually, but also every time the systems change or there's organizational changes. And my belief is that we need to get to a place where this is continuous validation, because we don't know when we're going to need it until we need it. Could be a rolling brownout, could be a ransomware attack, could be anything. And
certainly in California it could be.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's at that point that you need to know, does it work, not it worked 11 months ago.
Well, listen, where do you see the shifting in this whole backup and recovery area, the best practices as we roll into the rest of this century? What is, and I always say sometimes, if I came in as a new CIO, I want to put up the paramount defense that I could. And I'm not sure where to start. I know there's a lot of tools and solutions that are mentioned in the manuals and in NIST manuals, et cetera, but how do you create that environment that allows you to sleep at night and to be able to do it as the clock moves forward into the future?
Well, certainly following the manuals that are in place today is a very good start. And for anyone who hasn't done that, excellent place to start. And then continuous testing of that. My belief is, though, that innovation is going to drive the industry forward. All the big security steps that we have taken at a market level have been when it's been baked into the underlying framework. And I believe we're at that transition point right now. I think there's innovation around things like continuous data protection that are essential. I think there's innovation around intelligent data protection that are essential that we're only beginning to tap now.
Well, that's very interesting, and this is kind of the mundane side of backup and recovery. Never thought it'd be this interesting, right? When in the old days, backup put me to sleep. But now, with disasters and, as I mentioned, impacts on your career, your organization, and elections even, this is there's nothing further in the front than the whole issue. What in Veeam in particular? What are you focused on in the future? What's going to happen? How is Veeam going to be supplying the kind of best practices that the industry needs and the users need out there in the marketplace?
Sure. So one of the things we've actually just introduced is this thing called continuous data protection. What we've done as an industry, we tried to lower what we call the RPOs, recovery point objectives. And so we would do a backup once a week, and then once a day, and then once an hour, and every 15 minutes, and you get lower and lower. And at the same time, the data is exploding. So you have Teslas driving down the road collecting gigabytes of data continuously. And those two things are unsustainable, where you want more and more data collection points as well as exploding data. So we actually believe a better way to do this is to continuously watch the data and then take data protection based on intelligence rather than necessarily taking point-in-time snapshots. So one of the things, for example, we call it continuous data protection, but we watch all the flow, the I/O flow, this is maybe too technical, but going between the hypervisor down to the storage level so that you can replicate it off to a secondary system. And maybe you're not taking snapshots every 15 seconds, but you can say, there was an election yesterday. I need to know what the data looked like at 2:37 p.m. in the 76th, can't have 76 seconds, 16-second, roll back to a very specific point in time. Rather than just continuously capturing snapshots, go back in a journal to say, that's when I want to look at.
All right, great. One of the other things I mentioned before as we go from on the Sublime side is there's actual work going on now that takes that whole issue of backup not from a cost center, but to a profit center.
Yes.
From the standpoint of analytics. Talk about that a little bit, because that's certainly something that I don't think we talk about enough in terms, geez, we're mostly just scared of this whole thing and afraid to do anything about it and are worried, go to bed every night worried about it.
Yes.
But here's something really on the positive side that could turn a lot of this around, certainly come up with some funds for what they want to do on the protection side.
Very important, because security and data protection has always been looked at as a cost center. But there are actually benefits to doing some of this. So one is you can reuse the data for multiple purposes. So an example of this is as we develop new digital systems in this digital transformation journey, I'm doing online license renewal, or I'm doing online tax returns. One of the things that we can actually do is take the copies of data that we have and give it to developers to build better, newer systems. So if we're already collecting the data, let's leverage it for positive purposes in creating these new digital services. Another example is forensics. Let's say something that actually happens. You don't want to stop all the systems for 2 weeks while you do analysis. You take your data snapshot, you give it to your forensic scientists, they do it on the side, and the system continues to run. And so there's positive things that we can do with this data that we're collecting.
Is that actually happening out there now? Anybody?
A little bit, very little bit, and mostly on the commercial and enterprise side, very little on the government side, as you might expect.
But what makes it, how does the backup side facilitate that, rather than just do it? Is it just a fact of it, you don't want to go against the live data? This makes it easier to practice with, if you will, and, and knock up against it all you want, and kick the tires, et cetera, et cetera.
Without impacting production.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Absolutely. Because, that's the other thing that we have. Not only do you have a chief information officer and chief information security officer, now you have chief data officers and chief contact officers and other things like that blossoming up around the country, both in the private sector. California has their own data officer. So this would be, who would have thunk that he'll be interested in backup and recovery just for that reason? And I bet it'll make a lot of sense. I'd be curious about just how many folks are actually doing that, and where the market could go on it, because analytics is probably next to security, maybe the hottest topic, at least in government these days, if not in the private sector as well.
Machine learning. It's where the industry is going from an innovation, and we don't even know, I would submit to the audience, we don't even know necessarily the uses for this data right now. They'll evolve over time.
Right. I mean, and of course with government, the data has long been, you can't see mine. I mean, they didn't share it. Trying to get information from franchise tax board to the Board of Equalization or any of these departments is very, very difficult. I used to get so frustrated when I hear that social workers were dealing with their case management systems couldn't get information from the school system about the kid. I mean, come on. If a kid misses 10 days of school, that's a pretty good indicator something's wrong. And that data is not being shared, in many cases.
Transparency has always been an issue, and here's an opportunity to innovate in the industry. It's around blockchain technology. The reason why it's not been shared, by the way, often is because they're worried about who's accessing what they're going to do with it. There's no visibility. But if we apply blockchain technology or some of the new techniques that are coming, we can actually audit and track every single request, where the data went to, who touched it, and it can give greater transparency to the citizens of the state.
One of the big challenges about that, and of course we're kind of getting away from the security side of it, but interestingly enough, the biggest obstacle that I have discovered, and that I've confirmed with a number of my colleagues, former colleagues, CIOs across the country, was getting access to these databases and doing something with them. The folks that are the actual custodians of data are so embarrassed by the content of the data, they don't want to make it available to third parties, let alone for John Q. Public to start going through the expenses of the Commonwealth of Virginia or whatever. It causes a lot of controversy among the folks that don't want their data shared, even in this day and age.
That is true. I believe, though, the market will shift this a little bit. Over in Europe, and it's moving this way, the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, in the UK just launched something called the Data Protection Act, but it's giving more control and ownership to citizens in those circumstances over their own data. And I believe that privacy shift will move into the U.S. and across the states, and certainly to the state of California, which will give the citizens more control, and that will require, by definition, better mechanisms for sharing that information. It's privacy, not security, but very important.
I hope you're right. If what they used to say that if everybody thought like you, things would be a lot different around this place, because it is quite the challenge. It's taken the state of California just awarded a contract in the past few months, actually, to do a real down and dirty data analytic review of Medi-Cal claims. Medi-Cal is a cute $100 billion budget item in the state of California. 50-50 states feds, $100 billion. Estimates are the fraud could be anywhere from 10 to 20%. And when I was CIO 20 years ago, I tried to get that done. And I couldn't get it past the powers that be in the healthcare services. They said, we don't need that, Flynn, we're already doing that. Well, they finally awarded a contract. They finally awarded a contract for 20 years. And I'm telling you, they expect, because it's a high crime, organized crime industry now, where you have people all over the world that are accessing systems, the Medicaid, called Medi-Cal in California, and pulling dough out of there like you read, and then shutting down and moving on to the next jurisdiction. So it'll be really interesting to see how that project goes. Well, because they've been saying for years, oh, there's only 1 or 2% in California. Well, when they really see the numbers, like Malcolm Sparrow at Harvard points out, and he's a former cop from London, a really interesting guy. I've spoken to him a number of times about this. He wrote the book, License to Steal, all about the fraud in the government programs and how prevalent it is and how difficult it is to get the people to go after it. Because, number one, you don't want to go after the beneficiaries, but all right, let's go after the corporations, the ones that are actually, or the fake corporations are actually doing this fraud. It's a tough sell. 20 years, we'll see what happens.
Hopefully it doesn't take 20 years.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. I hope you're right. Couple other things just before we only got a few minutes left here, but it seems to me we've covered most of them. Is there anything I've missed out? I know that I seem to recall some huge number about the cost of a typical downtime, and wasn't it tens of millions of dollars?
It is. So we do a study every year at my organization. It's about $22 million is the cost of the average downtime. But to give an actual tactical example of this, there was just a study a few months ago, Erie County Medical Center, it's in the state of New York, $10 million. They were hit by ransomware. It was $10 million to recover from that. And if you look at those incidents in the state of California, there's been one in Chino Hills, there's been one at Alvarita, there's been Hollywood Presbyterian has been mentioned several times because they paid out. There's real financial implication to these events.
Yeah, I bet. I know in the headline just in the paper yesterday was they called a black sky event. I imagine it's over the black swan, white swan thing, but the feds are preparing for widespread power outages across the country and gearing up for a catastrophe that would bring society to its knees. Isn't that scary?
It's very scary.
I'm telling you. And you just think it could happen. If there's a power goes out for a couple hours, I mean, people are going crazy in the streets.
And it's
I shouldn't
lives,
say crazy in the
actually.
streets, going crazy everywhere because not only the heat or it could be the cold, wherever. It's a huge issue.
Air conditioning, medical systems. It's an inconvenience, certainly, to you and I with our phones and computers and things, but in some industries, actually, in some government agencies, it could be a life or death thing. Yeah.
Famous last words. What do you have to say, particularly if you're talking to the folks at home, the government technology coordinators, CISOs, and probably more importantly, we talked about this a little bit, but can't stress enough having a champion in the executive suite that is, in government in particular, that is behind the security leaders of your organization. You don't have that. You're tilting at windmills.
Yes, so I believe the biggest benefit of this ransomware and all of this malicious activity we're facing is the awareness that it's raising. Having Peter Lieberts who are going out and communicating the message across the agencies, having the champions that are actually improving not just the compliance regulations, but also the actual security of the agencies and departments that we run. Yeah.
Well, it's exciting times, right? It's not going to put you to sleep, that's for sure. It's not your backup and recovery of your grandmother, right?
No.
Well, very good. Thank you very much. That's going to conclude our program today. I want to thank you all for joining us and supporting our show. We always look forward to your comments and to your suggestions on guests and show. As I said, guests of the show, topics to consider. Hope you've enjoyed our first C-level series. We'll be having a lot more of those in the future. And special thanks, of course, to our guest, Danny Allan. We'll have a chance to explore some of the more controversial issues at our reception afterwards with our sponsor, Veeam Software. Thank you very much for today. On behalf of the Tech Leader TV, we're very proud to have Danny on to inaugurate our new program. Remember, we have Amy Tong coming on, Chief Information Officer, who will be the, as usual, every CIO for the state of California, bar he, who shall not be named, has been on this show before. And Amy will join us on August 31st, so watch for details on that. And we got a newsletter coming out, Tech Leader TV newsletter, where we've actually putting together a staff of freelance writers, and we're really going to jump into this with 2 feet to bring some greater coverage of some of the good news and bad news, management improvements, and less than that over the course of the show. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to catch us on Channel 18. Check your local listings, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Show.